Hi everyone, Tarekith here, and today I'm going to be looking at the Roland TR-8S. I've been pretty excited to kind of get my hands on one of these for a while now. I cut my teeth with the Roland MC505. It was pretty much my introduction into electronic music and groove boxes in specific, and it's been quite some time since I've owned any of the newer Roland boxes, so I've been curious to see what they're up to and see how they compare. Let's start with just the hardware itself. There's a lot to cover here, so I'm going to go kind of fast. I hope you'll bear with me. The hardware itself kind of reminded me of the Machina Mark III, and that when I first got it, it felt kind of cheap. I was slightly disappointed. It is quite plasticky. The top is metal, but the sides and bottom and everything is like a single molded plastic enclosure. But like the Machina Mark III, I think over time it's kind of grown on me. It's sturdier than I realized. I just miss the days of all hardware or all steel enclosures, I guess. But it is quite solid. It feels like it would hold up some touring. It just had like an initial kind of plasticky feel to me that I wasn't quite expecting. In terms of connectivity, you've got individual outputs for most of the channels. You've got a stereo main output, a headphone output, a Kensington security lock. You've got external inputs in stereo or mono. There's a trigger output if you need to send signals to any of your CV gear, which is quite handy. There's an SD card slot. It doesn't come with an SD card, but you can use the SD card for importing samples as well as backing up everything inside the unit itself. We have dedicated MIDI in and out ports, which is nice to see. There's also a USB port. USB can be used for USB MIDI as well as USB audio, and you can even separate all 11 tracks as separate audio streams over USB, which is quite handy. You do need to install a driver from Roland to do that, but so far, at least on my MacBook Pro, it's worked flawlessly. There's a power switch on and off. I'll admit this feels really cheap to me. It's really small. It just doesn't feel like the quality of the rest of the box. It does have a wall wart power supply, but there is a cable lock to keep that from coming out. Unfortunately, the placement of the cable lock I find kind of weird. If you actually engage this to keep the cable from pulling out for the power supply, the plug sticks up above the top of the case, or it covers the on-off switch. It seems like it's kind of crammed in there and really not well thought out. That's one of the few complaints I have about the actual hardware itself, though. I mean, other than the plasticky feel and this cable lock and switch being kind of cheap and in the wrong spot, the rest of it's actually a much better feeling than I expected. So let's take a closer look. I'll go over some of the functions and the features, and then we can come back and do a quick wrap up, and I'll let you know what I think overall. Okay, so here we are zoomed in a little closer on the panel. We can take a look at how this box works. Overall, I think the controls themselves feel pretty good. They're fairly solid. They have a nice rubberized coating on them. Both the knobs and the faders have this nice feel to them. There's just enough resistance, not too little, not too much. The other buttons on here, these smaller ones, have a nice feel as well. They're kind of rubberized coating. They're not very clicky, which I like. These little chiclets here on the bottom actually feel a lot better than I expected they would just by looking at the pictures. The colors are good. I like the fact that on the TR-8S we can actually assign our own colors to channels now. Every single channel can be whatever color you want. You're not just stuck with green anymore. One of the downsides of this, I think, and maybe not the colors, but when you enter mute mode, you lose those colors. Everything goes back to green, which is kind of a shame. Like, I know my kick drums are always going to be red, or whatever instruments I might assign or samples I might assign, like purples and things. You lose that when you're in mute mode, which is kind of a shame, but that's the only downside as far as the colors go. As you can see, there's 11 instruments per kit. You have 128 kits you can use. There's also 128 patterns. The patterns are organized in banks of 8, with 16 patterns in each bank. And that's how you select them. Pretty easy. You can link and unlink kits and patterns. So if you want to use the same kit with multiple patterns, you can do that, or you can have every single pattern be its own unique kit. That's not a problem either. We also have global controls. There's a global accent, a volume for the external input, main volume. There's the global reverb level, the delay level, time and feedback, which is nice. There's also a master effect you can assign per kit. In my case, I use like a low pass, high pass combination filter. Most of these master effects are more performance oriented. You're not going to find like choruses and flangers and things like that in there. We also have this quite useful autofill in section, which I can cover a little more once we get into the actual pattern aspects. To start with, let's kind of go see what we can do is with samples. You can load up to, I believe it is 600 seconds of mono samples or 300 seconds of stereo samples. I absolutely love the fact that we can use stereo samples. It greatly expands the sounds this can make. You can make nice wide pads and things like that without using a bunch of effects to rely on your stereo width. One of the useful things that Roland has done, there's a lot of little shortcuts built into this box. It's definitely worth reading the manual, but as you're scrolling through all your different samples, if you hold shift, you'll actually scroll through the sample categories. You can see the name up top here. The other nice thing is it comes with a bunch of defined sample categories, but you can actually create your own. I've got some further down in lowercase letters. You can actually create up to 32 of your own sample banks settings. Basically, you can make your own names up. So if you want to have like stabs or airy pads, things like that, you can actually do that and assign them to all of your own individual samples. It's a little tedious to do this, but they give you that option, which is nice. To edit samples, you can edit individual sample settings. Press Shift and press the sample button. Start time, end time, the gain for each sample, what the category is. Here's how you choose the different categories. You can see there's a bold U there for a user category. And then you can actually name the individual samples too. It will pull the names off the sample files when you import them up to a certain character length, which is pretty handy. That's it for sample parameters. You can actually save your sample settings. So if you change like the gain for a sample and you always want to use that gain, you can save that, not a problem. With the right mode, you can save kits, you can save system settings, you can save patterns, things like that. Each of the 11 tracks is assigned to an instrument. Basically, an instrument is either one of the built-in default Roland sounds, 808, 909, 626, or your samples. Show you some of the parameters available to instrument edit. You can tune the individual samples. Actually, I'm sorry, you can tune the individual instruments. This is for the 808 kick, the decay time for it, coarse tune, the rate, which is basically the speed of the sample, the speed of the instrument. The spread, you can change the stereo spread, make it like kind of fake stereo, which is nice, although obviously the more you use that, you'll collapse stuff into mono. You can bit reduce it, you can change the attack, hold time. There's filters. The filter type, you have a couple different types to choose from. You have low pass filter, high pass filter. These are again just for the samples, but still pretty useful. Resonance filter attack, there's a filter envelope for each individual instrument as well. Level gain for the instrument itself. Panning, you have an individual reverb send and delay send. This is where you assign the LFO. One thing that was kind of slightly misleading to me when I was reading about the TR-8S is that you hear it's got up to individual LFOs for each channel, and that's kind of misleading. There's actually a global kit LFO with one individual speed and LFO type, but you can assign that LFO, that kit LFO, to individual parameters on each instrument track. So it's still really useful, but unfortunately you don't get an individual LFO for each instrument like I thought you did. LFO depth. These are the insert effects on each track type. There's a low boost we have right now, a high boost. There's the low pass, high pass filter like I had on the master channel a second ago. Low pass filter, high pass filter. So you can actually have two filter types on each instrument channel, which is nice. Through is basically off. Let's see, what other ones do we have? There's also low and high boost. There's an isolator, so you can isolate specific frequencies, kind of like a single band EQ. There's a transient shaper. There's a built-in compressor for every single instrument. Drive, compressor and drive, bit crusher, and that's pretty much it. Those are the effects you get for every single instrument channel. Still not too bad. It's quite useful. The range of parameters available for those I find is really, really well designed. We get out of the effects. You can change the effects balance, how wet or dry it is. You can alter the sample rate for the sample. Here's the filter setting as well for the effects. So those are the basic instrument settings for the built-in instruments. Now, if you have samples selected, there's actually quite a few more parameters available. You can tune the samples. You get decay, coarse tune, rate for the sample, again, spread, bit reduce, attack, hold mode. A lot of these are pretty similar, as you'll see. Panning, reverb sends, LFO assignments, different effects types. I have effects off here as well. So you have quite a bit of control over both the built-in sounds and any samples you want to import. Now, in addition to having the ability to edit all those parameters for the instrument, there's also kit level settings too. So we'll go ahead and edit those. He'll shift and press kit to enter the edit. You can change the level of the overall kit. One of the nice things about this box, there's so many different ways to control the volumes of both individual channels, your samples, the kit, and plus the global volume. So it's really easy to gain stage everything properly. There's also a built-in utility setting where actually it boosts the main output by 6 dB. So if you find you're in a club and it's just too quiet competing with, say, CDJs or something like that, you can apply boost, and there must be some kind of limiter built in because it doesn't seem to overdrive very easily unless you really, really crank things up, even with that 6 dB setting. So that's quite a nice feature for live performance. You also have the, this is where you choose your reverb for the kit, on the kit level. There's like a modulated reverb that I like to use a lot, plate, different hall settings and room, and just like a general ambience for like real subtle things. We also have the same reverb time, reverb level. You can assign the pre-delay. There's a low cut on the reverb, a high cut on the reverb, so you can kind of decide how warm or dry it is. Density on the reverb, so if you hear a lot of little individual flutters, or if it's just nice and smooth. Delay, there's a few different delay types. There's a basic delay, there's a panning delay, there's a tape echo, which is actually really, really nice. Quite a few parameters for the tape echo. If I leave that on, show you that. You can tempo sync it. There's a level, the delay time, feedback, the bass on the delay, treble delay, the panning, for all the individual, there's like a multi-tap tape delay. And you can choose where the stereo placement of each tap is. There's also tape distortion you can apply, wow and flutter rate, wow and flutter depth. Again, here's the kit level master effects, so I can choose like the low pass, high pass filter like I showed you before, low pass filter, high pass filter individually. Again, high boost, low and high boost. There's the isolator for master effects, transient as well. Transient 2, which just gives you a little bit more control over like really, really sharp transients that I find. A kit level compressor. This is in addition to the individual channel level compressors. Same with the drive, overdrive, distortion, fuzz. So quite a few ways to like rough up individual kits. A bit crusher, a phaser, a flanger, a sideband filter, which is kind of similar to the isolator, but it works in reverse. It actually removes certain frequencies, which I find useful. And then you can apply noise if you want like white noise sweeps and things like that. So quite a lot of options for the effects on the kit level. Let's see what else we have here. Here's you can change the different colors for the different tracks if you want. That's how you pick the colors. There's a level for the master effects. There's also you can also sidechain the input. So if you have like a synth going into this, you actually sidechain it and choose the sidechain source, which is useful. There's a couple different sidechain types as well for different feels. You can also boost the external input. I think you get up to 16 dB of gain. Oh wait, I was wrong actually. 40 dB of gain, which is nice. Kit level panning for the external input. You can also send your external input to the reverb and delay sends, which is useful. Here's where you choose the kit level LFO. So like I said, there's only one LFO per kit. Choice of sine wave, triangle, saw, square, sample and hold. You can tempo sync it or not. This is where you can send each of the individual instruments to its own output or to the mix level output. Personally, I always just use stereo outputs. I've never actually really used individual outputs. I just like to treat it like an instrument as itself, so that works good for me. I'll go through all the different instruments here. You can do mute modes, which is basically like the same thing as like the open hi-hat will cut off the closed hi-hat symbol. You can do that again for the entire kit. You can assign which of these channels will cut off other channels. Very useful. This is where you can assign the individual control. So every single channel has not only a tune and decay knob, but it's also got a control knob, and you can assign this to be global. There's this control select button here. So we hold control select down, and I can make all of these control the instrument level effects, the LFO depth for each channel, the reverb send, the panning. So this is like a really quick way to change all of the knobs for every single channel to the same thing at once. Or you can hold this down and turn individual knobs to change the setting just for individual channels. So if you want the snare drum to be a coarse tune, but you want the toms to control color, it's really easy to do that. Roland's done a lot of little shortcuts like that to make it easier to make changes to your kits and your instrument settings without having to go through menus. As you can see, there's actually quite a few menus to go through, but if you read the manual and the shortcuts, there's a lot of ways to speed things up. For instance, if you want to control an individual track level of, say, your bass drum, you can just hold bass drum down and the accent level. You can change the accent knob to change the accent just for that instrument. The snare drum can have a separate accent level from the bass drum. If you want to change the reverb send for an instrument, you just hold the instrument select button down and move the reverb knob, and it only affects just that instrument. Same thing with the delay as well. There's a lot of little shortcuts like that are really, really useful to know. Likewise, when you're in one of these kit editing modes, if you hold shift and turn this data entry knob, I should go into edit mode, you'll actually jump through different categories of edit categories. You can go right from the LFO to external input, the master effects. You don't have to continually scroll through every single parameter through the whole menu list. You can jump through sections. One of the downsides about this is that at least I found is that for some reason Roland put like the filter settings in with like the overall kind of level settings for the individual channels. So you've got level, let me pick a sample one, it's easier to show, sample channel. So we've got all these different things, instrument level, sorry. So let me back up again, explain this better. I've got a sample channel selected right now. There's a sample assigned to this instrument channel. And if I enter the instrument edit mode, you'll see I can change the tuning, the decay time, the coarse tune, all these things, but you have to scroll quite a bit before you actually get to the different to say filter cutoff. Whereas if I hold shift and go, it goes right from tuning to reverb send. Like there's no way to jump right to the filter, which is really interesting. I thought that was kind of a missed opportunity to have like the filter settings as like one of those broad categories you can hold shift and scroll to. It makes a little more sense once you use this a few times. I realize I'm kind of rushing through some of this. So aside from all those edit parameters for your samples, your instruments, and your kits, you also have like global utility parameters. You can change the LCD contrast. So we have knob mode direct, which means whatever the value of the knob is when you turn it, like the parameter assigned to that instantly jumps to the current parameter, or you can change it to catch mode, which means you have to actually pass the save parameter before the knob takes effect. That's more useful for live performance, where you don't want to grab a knob and start tweaking it and have the sound instantly jump to whatever the knob was set to instead of what the actual parameter was saved as. Some synths call this pass-through mode. Anyway, it's nice to have. Manual mode, you can make the front panel controls all live, active at all the time. So whatever you see is what you get. And on this, you can have like the level faders act that way. So whatever the level is, regardless of the kit settings, say you jump to a new kit, it'll use whatever the actual values set by these faders are instead of what is saved with the kit. Or you can do all of it. So it does the level faders as well as the individual knobs here. They will always be active and reflective of what the current knobs are instead of what's saved with the kit. So if you're a person who wanted to buy this box and just treat it just like a 909, you could call up a 909 preset kit and then set it to manual mode for everything, and then whatever you see is always going to be active at any one time, just like a real 909 drum machine. You don't have to worry that if you call up a new kit, like suddenly your sounds are going to change different than what the actual knobs are. Pattern lock, I mentioned before, you can have individual, you can have 128 kits and 128 patterns. Pattern lock means that when you call up a new pattern, it'll call up the saved kit with that pattern. If you turn that off, you can call up a new pattern and it will keep the current kit that was playing. I like to have it individually assigned where a new pattern is always assigned to a new kit. It's just easier for me to organize things for live sets that way. Start pattern, when you power off the unit, you can tell it to power back on with the last pattern you were working on or a specified pattern. Say you always want to start with pattern in bank 3, number 4 for a live set. You can actually specify that here, which is useful. Same with the kits, it'll always call it. You can specify which kit will be loaded when you first turn the unit on. The tempo source, you can have a global tempo source, or you can have individual tempos for each pattern if you want. Same thing for shuffle. There's a shuffle knob here. You can have a global shuffle for all patterns at once, or just individual shuffles for each pattern that gets saved. Again, with the kit select as well, you can choose it to select a new kit with each pattern or keep the current kit. The instrument pad. Roland's done something interesting with the TR-8S compared to the TR, and they've given you this kind of a way to have a velocity-sensitive pad to enter notes into your sequences. These little chiclets down here aren't velocity sensitive, they're just on-off switches. So Roland instead has said, okay, we'll select your instrument sound, and then you can use this pad to enter velocity as you're recording. It's a great idea in theory. The downside is this pad is not very sensitive at all. It's extremely hit or miss as far as it even registers some of my taps sometimes, especially very light taps. In the utility setting, you can specify different like velocity curves, like basically just light, medium, and hard. But I find it has very little effect into how responsive this actually is. I think it's a great idea. I think it just doesn't work very well. It doesn't register very light tips. There's times I've hit it and it doesn't register at all. I don't think it's faulty. I just think it's a cheaper sensor underneath, and it's not quite as accurate as this could be. It's one of the few downsides to the hardware itself, other than the switch that I mentioned before in the back, the power switch, and this location for the cable lock, that I just wish Roland had kind of spent a little bit more money on, even if that meant passing it on to the end user. So it's better than just entering notes with these if you're trying to do velocity stuff, but it isn't very accurate at all. Let's see. M trigger latch, I'll be honest, I forgot what that one is for. Oh, I'm sorry, that's for the fills. You can have quite a few different fills for each pattern. I'll cover that in a second. This just specifies that when you press the manual button, if the fill only works while you hold the button down, or if you just press it once and it plays the fill automatically without you actually having to hold it down. Weak beats, you can enter like softer, quieter beats by holding shift and pressing one of these buttons. And that just tells you helps you specify how those are entered. You can make it either so you hold shift to do that, or it'll just, if you turn it off, it'll just cycle through on, off, and quiet, basically. I like using the shift method for entering weak beats. USB audio, this means you can assign individual channels to go over USB audio channels for your DAW. So if you want to have like all of your drum sounds except the bass go over the main USB feed, you can do that and have the bass transmitted over just a separate USB audio feed. So quite a bit of flexibility there. Autosave, it'll actually remember all your settings when you turn the unit off if you want. Personally, I don't use that. Excuse me. With this setting here, you can reload the pattern. So if you made a bunch of pattern changes, you've entered new notes, you can actually reload the pattern back to what the save value was. And again, you can do this with the kits as well. If you tweaked a bunch of settings, you want to go back to the original kit settings you saved, you can do that. Unfortunately, this is the hugest complaint I have about this unit, is that there's no way to do this on the fly. People have used Electron boxes, have heard of the kit reload. You just hold 2 button combinations down and you can instantly reload the kit. It doesn't work like that on the TR-8S. You have to go into the utility menu. What's useful is that you can leave the utility menu and call up like a new pattern and a new kit. And if you go back into the utility menu, it remembers where you were in the menu structure. So my thought was, well, I don't have to use utility mode that much. I could just leave it set here and then reload the kit, but it takes 3 buttons to reload the kit and it's not instantaneous. There is like a jump in the sound when that happens. So unfortunately, it's not as useful as, say, on the Electron kit reload. I really, really, really wish Roland would give us a button combination on the front panel to do this live on the fly. It would really open up so much what you can do with the box itself. That is by far my biggest complaint about this from just a performance standpoint. It's not a huge deal, but it would definitely make things a lot easier to get back to save settings after the fact. We made a lot of tweaks. As you can hear, now I've messed up my pattern by just tweaking things, so I have to go and reload the kit. And I'll show you how this isn't really real time. So if I want to do that little kit reload like I was showing you, just press enter 3 times. Oh, I actually have the panel mode set to live by mistake as well, so it's not reloading. Anyway, you get the idea. So we have kit reload. This is where you import samples. You can import banks of samples all at once. You don't have to import just one. You can delete samples in memory. You can only do it one at a time, so it's very, very tedious if you import a bunch of samples and decide you don't want them. This is where you set the category names. You can create your own categories for the samples. Oops. Sample optimize. The memory storage can get fragmented if you import a lot of samples over and over again. This is just a chance for you to optimize it to make sure that the samples are streamed properly. You can change the brightness of the LEDs. You can change the brightness of the little glow they call these little channel strips, as well as the sliders. Sliders can be controlled colors by kit, or they can have global colors if you want. There's a demo mode that turns on automatically. It makes the colors go all kinds of pretty rainbows. Tempo sync can be automatic, or you can specify just USB, just MIDI input, or off. Same with the sync out. Again, more MIDI settings: receive, start, and stop, MIDI device ID, Omni mode, different MIDI channels for pattern changes, kit channels, instrument note for this little instrument thing to play. USB MIDI through, soft through, transmit program changes, edit data. So if you turn the knobs, you can nudge. There's nudge settings for the patterns. You can transmit that over MIDI clock if you're syncing other external gear. Receive program changes, edit data. Let's see what else. Individual sign outputs. The external input type, it can be stereo or separate left and right mono if you want. You can initialize the whole unit. You can exchange data from, say, one kit from one pattern to another kit from another pattern. You can export your kits, your patterns, which is nice. Those all go to the memory card. What else do we have? You can import those exported settings later if you want to import just individual kits or individual patterns. You can back up. I mentioned this before. You can save as with, you can rename your backups. You can have multiple backups on here. I've got 3. I've got the factory sounds, I've got my own current live set programming, and then I've got like a blank template. So if I ever get another idea, I can just call that up really quick and start from scratch. I should say not really quick. It takes about 2 to 3 minutes to reload a backup, so it's not something you'd probably want to do on the fly. Yeah, so that's how you reload with the restore menu, and then you can do the factory reset. You can format the SD card. You can see the software version number. And that's about it for the utility settings. So there are some menu diving. You can really fine tune everything from your instruments, your samples, and some of the utility settings for like global parameters. But you don't have to focus on that. I went through and did all that kind of stuff once and saved it as a template so that I don't have to worry about it anymore. The one thing I do want to touch on now, like the most important aspect of this, is the performance settings. So like I said, you have 128 patterns. Each pattern can have 8 different 1-bar measures selected over here. I'm going to power cycle this really fast because something happened while I was demonstrating all those different global patterns, global settings. Let's call this up again. Okay, so as I was saying, each pattern that you have can have up to 8 measures. You can have between 1 and 8 bars. So if you press all these buttons at once, you can have it play 8-bar patterns if you want. You can skip patterns, so skip measures. So if you want just B, C, D, and G, you can have, like, say, 3 bars. So always go sequentially through the alphabetized. So B will do D, will do G. There's no way to say play G, then B, then D. There's an autofill in function, which is super useful. So when you hold down this, turn autofill in on, you can specify that the fills you select will play every 2 bars, every 4 bars, 8, 16, or 32 bars. You select, let's do it with, make it a little easier. You select a fill by holding down the fill in button, and there's basically 3 options you have down here. You have 2 user-definable fills. They're both 1 measure long, and there's also the scatter function from the original TR by pressing button 16. Personally, I find this is kind of gimmicky sounding. It's a little over-the-top stutter settings. I think there's like 16 different scatter effects you can choose. That's the least intrusive one. From there, they get just to like crazy rapid 64s and things. I'm sure it's good for some genres, but for me, most of the scatter settings are over the top. I do like the fact that I can choose define my own fills though. In addition to assigning these 2 measures of user fills, you can also select one of the other 8 bars. The normal 8 bars as a fill too if you want. To manually trigger those, you just press the button. So that's this fill 14 I have, the first fill. I'll select another fill, press the button again. That one's just silent, everything drops out. So anyway, the fill function is really useful. The fact you can quickly program your own fills, you just hold shift and press autofill, and this is how you edit the fills to create your own patterns. Let's see what else. In addition to those settings for the patterns, you can also specify a last step. So you can do polyrhythms, so you can have a last step on a kit level, so you can have like your entire kit, like all the instruments in the kit only have 13 steps. For instance, or you can have individual track lengths for each of the 11 instruments, so you can do some pretty complex polyrhythms. In addition to that, there's also these sub-steps. So let's just enter one of those. Sub-steps are kind of like flams. And you can change the sub-step. And sub-steps can also be weak beats, like I mentioned before, lower velocity. Just hold shift to press those. You can see the light got a little dimmer. So you can make it quite subtle, and you can change the volume level for the sub-steps to the weak beats. You don't actually have to have it that quiet. You can choose the individual volumes for those by holding down stip, and I believe it's pressing, yes, the accent knob. So this is how you change the velocity for individual steps in quite an easy way, regardless of what the step type is. Again, another one of those really handy shortcuts where it pays to read the manuals a little bit. I think that's covering most of it. There is motion recording. You can actually record parameters in real time. So let's do that with this motion recording over here. record all the knobs and the faders in real time for all the channels, which is useful. One function that is kind of very briefly mentioned in the manual that I find really, really useful, kind of related to the automation, is if you hold Shift and press Control Select, there's actually like a mixer screen where you can see the level for all the different channels. You can see the tuning for all the different channels, the decay settings, the panning, reverb sends, your delay sends, LFO depth, the gain. A lot of times I like to have all my volume faders up all the way and use this gain parameter to actually balance the kit, so I can just slam a fader up when I'm performing and not have to worry about it jumping out, like being too loud or too quiet. Let's go back to the gain. So yeah, really useful. The other thing I like is this tuning now. So as you saw, I recorded the tuning automation for the snare drum. And if you're in the mixer screen, you can actually see that in real time. And this isn't even mentioned in the manual. So any automation you record, you actually see in real time in each channel if you want. Let's do it again for this. So now you can actually see this is even changing. This is for the bass drum decay. So it's a really quick way to see all your automation happening at once for all these recorded knob movements in this nice little mixer screen. Again, it's mentioned very briefly in the manual. I think there's only like 5 or 6 sentences about it, and yet it's something I use all the time. Finally, we have a mute mode, so we can mute individual channels. I mentioned this before, the colors, you lose kind of the color aspect. That's how you mute different channels. I wish that the sliders at least stayed the same color that I saved, but unfortunately that's not how it works. If you want to cancel all the mutes at once, you just hold mute and hit clear. It happens instantaneously. It doesn't wait for the next pattern or anything like that. But again, really nice live performance mode. So I think that covers kind of the basics of it. There's a lot of depth and functionality to this. You can make it as simple as you want or as complicated as you want. Like I said, if you just call up like one of the stock 808 or 909 kits and put the panel in manual mode, it's basically what you see is what you get, just like on the original 909. Or you can go in and make very, very detailed settings for your samples, your instruments, all the different kits. You can choose all kinds of crazy effects. There's all kinds of little shortcuts for controlling those, like holding down instrument track and turning reverb changes the reverb. Get out of this mode. This is how you change the reverb send for individual instruments. Just again, those little shortcuts Roland included. So yeah, definitely, if there's one thing I could tell anybody interested in this or someone who's already bought it, is make sure you go through the manual a couple times. There's actually 2 manuals. There's an operation manual and a reference manual. The reference manual has everything the operation manual has and then some. You could probably skip the operation manual entirely and just read the reference manual. There's a ton of little shortcuts that I haven't covered that Roland was kind enough to include, and they make a huge difference when playing live if you can memorize those. And for the most part, once you kind of get how Roland thinks about their shortcuts, they're pretty easy and intuitive to figure out. A lot of times you'd be like, oh, well, if I hold this and turn this, will it do what I think it does? And it does. So definitely take a look at that if you're interested in this box. There's a lot of hands-on control that Roland's included that isn't obvious from the front panel, and I think you'd be missing out to not know about those functionalities. So that's it. Quite a lot to cover. Like I said, I kind of breezed through quite a bit of this. Let's take a step back and I'll give you my overall thoughts on the unit. Okay, so that's kind of a quick overview of what the TR-8S can do and how it's laid out, organized, etc. Overall, I have to say I'm really surprised and impressed at what Roland's done. They've included a lot of functionality that from a musician standpoint or a live performer standpoint makes sense and is really intuitive. At the same time, there's a lot deeper editing functions than I expected for this box, especially if you get into samples. I think the fact that you can load stereo samples is the real highlight of the TR-8S. I think that's another reason why it's important to not consider this just a drum machine, but actually what Roland calls it the rhythm performer, because the fact that you have so many hands-on ways of manipulating your samples and the performances in real time is a huge, huge bonus. I think it's a real disservice to think of it as just like an 808 or 909 clone. In terms of those kind of sounds, like I mentioned, I think they're fine. I think they're standard 808, 909 sounds. They sound really good. I don't know how accurate they are to the originals. Personally, I don't even care about that kind of thing. They sound great as they are, and I'm probably going to load my own samples in most of the time anyway. The overall sound quality of this as well is excellent. I had a Electron Analog Rhythm Mark II for a while, and while that had some nice punchy sounds, I really had to spend a lot of time dialing in every single sound and fine-tuning filters and things to get the punch quite right and not be too muddy. Right out of the box, it's really simple to dial in drum sounds or even full complete groove box style patterns. And there's enough editing functionality between EQs and global effects and individual channel effects to really shape exactly what you want to hear much, much quicker than the Electron box, in my opinion. So overall, yeah, I think Roland really nailed it with this. I only have a couple small complaints. The fact we couldn't reload kits on the fly, like with Electron boxes, I think is a real shortcoming. That's really, from like a live performance standpoint, my only downside. It's something I use often, and that would just really expand what you can do with this. But other than that, the fact there's so many different ways to manipulate patterns on the fly and alter your patterns and bring in fills and things like that is really, really impressive. Added to that, the deeper functionality you have, like I mentioned before, with sample editing, the fact you can create your own sample kits, you can create your own sample categories, so if you have your own sounds you want to find a lot easier, that Roland gives you the ability to actually do that and name your own categories is a huge time saver. The functionality they included for backing things up, the fact you can back up the entire unit itself in one go to one file is really, really useful. It takes a little while to load those backups. I probably wouldn't do it live like I mentioned, but the fact that they do that is really, really nice. The effects themselves sound incredible. The drum sounds sound incredible. The samples that come with it, other than the stuff you can load yourself, is actually pretty well thought out. There's a few cheesy instrument samples in there, but overall I actually thought that just the stock samples that came with it are great. It's especially great that those don't eat into your user memory too. I think that's really well thought out on Roland's part. So yes, I can definitely recommend this. If you want like a typical 808 Nano 9 clone, it'll serve you well. You can make it as simple to use as you want. If you want to dive in a little deeper, make it like a self-contained groove box, I think that's very easy to do as well, especially with the fact you can load stereo samples in there. It just hugely expands like the sonic potential of what this little box can do. So that's it for me. I think it's a great buy. I'm really happy with it. I think this is probably the drum machine for me. Hit the spots for me more than, like, say, Electronic Analog Rhythm has done or some of the Korg offerings. So yeah, I think for me, this is the one going forward that I'm going to spend most of my time with. If you have any questions, comments, or anything you'd like me to address, put it in the comments and I will get to it as soon as I can. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.